Hi, I'm Karen Nelson. I'm Dean of the School of Architecture at the Boston Architectural College. And when we speak of just space, we mean an inclusive environment that makes all community members feel welcome and confers a sense of balance, belonging, and well-being. Our lecture series, our exhibits, and our curricula aim to critique current conditions, suggesting ways to correct conditions of inequity and bring awareness and visibility to the design of just communities. Pardon me. This is our first event in our spring lecture series, Just Communities. We have with us this evening two stellar design professionals who work locally. They are both alumni of the BAC. Lucca Townsend graduated with her M.Arch' from the BAC in 2012 and is now an associate architect at Sasaki Design. And Ruthie Kuhlman received her M.Arch' in 2014 and is a senior associate at Rhodey. I asked both of these architects to share their graduate theses with you so you can envision making great work as they did, both as students and also see a bridge to the future, how their graduate inquiry links to the way they're thinking about architecture and design in their daily practices. Lucca Townsend's talk touches on how her thesis, A Cemetery in the City, led her to design spaces for shared experience within urban landscapes. She'll share her work on park buildings, urban sculptures, and projects that blend landscape and architecture. Lucca grew up in New York City and has a deep fondness for buildings and urban spaces, and she also loves the wilderness. Since 2016, she's been with Sasaki Associates, enjoying a deep collaboration with landscape architecture and planning there. Her undergraduate years were spent in Montreal at McGill University studying psychology, mental health, and social impact, all which continue to influence her design work. Ruthie Kuhlman's talk focuses on how concept and context can shape design and the experience of buildings. She looks at the exploration and discovery of space through circulation design of a new Boston Globe headquarters downtown, the creation of a new sculptural residence responding to a neighborhood along an East Boston Park, and more. Ruthie works across multiple scales and project types as both an architect and an engineer. She brings a passion for problem solving through thoughtful contextual design with experience in museums, hospitality, and multifamily residential projects. Prior to joining Rhodey Architects, she worked at Cambridge 7 Associates and Ad Inc. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering from Rice University. This is their first time lecturing as part of the formal lecture series. I don't think it will be their last. Please extend a warm welcome for Lucca Townsend and Ruthie Kuhlman as they give their respective talks.
Hi, I'm Lucca. Karen gave a great introduction, so I'll dive right in to talking about how my thesis turned into my work blurring architecture and landscape architecture. So in 2015, I was hiking in Maine and came across this cemetery where I met a man who was eating lunch on his future grave. And he told me about how he bikes there and eats there a lot. And everyone in his community has picked out their grave there and they have a celebration every year. And I thought, what an amazing way to create community and to sort of cement our place in the world and tie ourselves to place. This was right before I was starting my thesis. So I had the idea to do a cemetery for my thesis. And actually a couple weeks after my father passed away unexpectedly, and I had to decide, am I going to continue to do a cemetery for my thesis? And I'm really thankful that I did, because it was a wonderful way for me to grieve and for my family to grieve along with me. So research is the first part of thesis. How many of you are in thesis? I know there's people on there. Great. So I started off looking at funerary practices all over the world. And there's some crazy interesting things like a mushroom soup that decomposes you after you die. And one of my favorite ones was the Tibetan sky burial, where they live really high in the mountains, so they can't bury people. It's too rocky. And they're above the tree line, so there's no fuel for fire and they can't cremate people. So they build these amazing temples and they put the bodies on top of the temple, and the vultures come to take the bodies. And they think that that's the spirit getting passed on through the vulture and then creating a habitat and everything. So I was like, how can we figure out this merge of practical and spiritual for today's funerary tradition? And I did a lot of thinking about it and a lot of sketching, and was inspired by the Transcendentalists. I don't know how many of you have been to Mount Auburn Cemetery, but the idea there was to get people into the cemetery to reduce taboo around death. And I thought we had kind of lost that a little bit, and I want to bring it into our actual cities where we're living now and sort of connect people more to their cities through that, and have people walking down the street and see a funeral happening and get used to that idea. So the next step in your thesis is to pick a site. And I knew I wanted somewhere where people would be commuting every day, and also someplace that was near water for the amazing aspects that water holds. So I picked the Fort Point Channel and designed a cemetery bridge that people would cross on their way to work. And it's very curvy and has a lot of trees on it, and has this sort of plaza in the center here, where there's a chapel, as you can see on the right. And when you are buried here, first the viewing happens where you're looking out over the water. And then you're cremated, and the smoke of the cremation rises through the chapel like a chimney. And then on this side of this plaza is a museum. So when you bury someone there, you leave an object of theirs, and the museum starts out empty and it starts to fill up over time. So then I need to figure out how people would be buried here, what method would be used. And this was 5 years ago, so I actually would do it differently today. Things have changed so much. And back then I learned that in the past 15 years, so that was 20 years ago now, cremation had increased from 25% of funerals to 75%. So I thought that was a really great strategy, especially with a cemetery in the city where we don't have very much space. So the method was to cremate the body and then mix it with concrete, and they would actually become part of the bridge itself. If I were to do this today, I would do a green burial. So if you give me another year, I'd do another thesis. And throughout the project, people kept saying, like, isn't this a landscape project? And it didn't bother me too much because I didn't really care if it was or was not. And all my fellow students, some were landscape architects, interior designers, and I didn't see really a line, and I continued to blur that line through my professional work. So the first project I'll share with you is Bonnet Springs Park. This is a public park in Lakeland, Florida, and I was fortunate enough to work on it from master plan through opening day. I was working on my thesis during the master plan and heard about this project at my office. Really wanted to work on it, so I went to the principal and told her that, and she put me on the project, and every time they threatened to take me off, put me on another project, I was like, no, this is my baby. I'm working on this till the end. So I put my foot down, and really luckily they listened to me. And my role on this project, I worked on, there's 4 buildings in the park, I worked on every one of them. But more importantly, I was the liaison between all the disciplines, between landscape, civil, architecture, graphic design. This was the site before we started anything on it. It was a abandoned rail yard. The soil was contaminated with arsenic. There's a lake right here, but you can't see it. It's all covered by invasive plants, and it's full of trash also. But there were these amazing live oak trees and banana trees and all that Florida stuff in there already. This is a super multidisciplinary project. Like I said, there were architects, civil engineers, landscape architects, and graphics. We designed everything from the entire topography down to a font special to that park. And you can see how those lines of everyone in the project came to life. This is during construction. So with that contaminated soil, what we decided to do rather than truck it all off site was to create topography on site with it and then cap it with clean soil. And the area is super, super flat. So people are like amazed by these 50-foot mountains, they call them, and there's always children like rolling down them and everything. And it also allowed us to bury some of the buildings. So you can see here, we call this one the bridge building. It's buried by the two sides and kind of looks like it's emerging from the hills. And then in the distance, there's another building, the Welcome Center. So this one's 2 stories, but half buried in one of the hills. And it's the first building you see when you get to the park. It has a gift shop and a cafe and the park offices. And you'll see we use a lot of cypress, a local material, as well as this super white stucco, which is inspired by the Florida modern movement. And in each of the buildings, there's sort of a gradient of both. The next building is the Children's Museum, which is that bridge building I was talking about earlier. And during the community engagement, we were reaching out to the community and asking what they wanted in their park. And we met this director of the local Children's Museum who said, we don't have enough space. Can we build a museum in your park? And it was just the perfect marriage, because now kids come for the museum and then they didn't even know the park was there. And then they're spending time in this park. And we had a lot of fun designing this museum using colors and also research from neurodiversity and like how to like stimulate and de-stimulate kids. The next building is the Nature Center. So this is down, you can finally see the lagoon now. And it's connected into a bunch of paths that connect all the way through the park, including this canopy walk. And the Nature Center is actually a few smaller buildings because we didn't want to disrupt the wetland and the existing trees. So this is one of the buildings. It's a boathouse. You can rent a kayak and take it out on the lagoon. And this is another building. It's a little gallery that tells you about that like local habitat outside. The final building on the site is a event center. It's in the Botanic Gardens, and people have weddings there and retreats. And the amazing botanical gardens come all the way into the building with this floating wetland. And this is also one of the first mass timber buildings in Florida. So I'm really proud of that. One of the coolest things has been following the park's Instagram after it opened and seeing how people really love this park and are using it in ways we expected and didn't expect, like car show. Okay, now I'm gonna like shrink down in size to a super, super small plaza in Ogden, Utah. So this was an old motel that was very seedy and I don't know, drugs were there, all that stuff. And the city knocked it down to make way for this cornerstone of the arts community. And Ogden is one of my favorite clients ever. The people that work for the city there, they just want their city to be great. It's kind of like Parks and Rec, the show. And when you walk down the street, there's art and music, and the city is funding it and they're making space for it. So this was during our community engagement. We like had a kickoff at this plaza, which was just rubble. And people were dancing and doing projections. And we were listening to them about what they wanted for their plaza. And so this is some sketching on the big ideas. We wanted to be an outdoor gallery where they could have like rotating shows. And we also want to connect to the wider natural systems there and amidst these amazing mountains. And when you're standing in the site at ground level, you can't see the mountains, but if you're up 12 feet, you can. So we knew we needed to lift up part of the site. This is the project complete. In the back, you can see the plinth is what we call it, and that gets you up so you can see the mountains. And it also helps to create a few different spaces within that sort of outdoor gallery. There's like, we call it a stramp up to the top of the plinth. And then under the plinth, there's an LED screen for video art. And there's also a storage room. And that was my role in the project, was mainly the storage room, which I always wanted to be a secret bar. And we did drink wine there on opening night, so it's kind of a secret bar. And some other aspects you can see here, there's like stripes on the ground. Those are actually metal inlaid into the concrete. So you can really easily weld a sculpture to it and then remove it. And they also asked us to design the sculpture on the corner along with a local artist to kind of beckon people to come to the plaza from afar. Here's some images of that stramp with the first of the installations. This is Shakaya Booker. She makes these amazing sculptures out of tires. And then this view of We call that the folding planes, and it has misters. So when they're on, it kind of feels like you're in the foggy morning mountains. And this was opening night, so the plinth becomes this like stage where you can look down on what's happening below. And that's the LED screen underneath. Okay, my final project, we're going way back up in scale. This is Olinikon Park in Athens, Greece. And so this is the old airport. Miles and miles of runway, closed in the 1990s. You can see the blue line is the old airport. The orange line was turned into the Olympic sites after that airport closed in the 90s. And then we also have this in purple down below, the coastal front. That's all part of this park. It's bigger than Central Park. It has like lots of train stops within it. And this is also what it looks like. So miles of runway. The old Olympic grounds look like ruins, even though they're just from the 90s. This was the old canoe kayak racing pool, so it used to have water in it. And then the coastal front has just these like weird relics, and there's like an old disco hall and a lot of trash. And the airport was actually designed by Eero Saarinen, and now it looks like a zombie apocalypse happened. There's like luggage and dead plants, but they're going to turn it into a museum, so that's gonna be super cool. And this is the full project. So the Saarinen building is here, and there's a big event lawn in front of it. We turned the canoe kayak into a lake that people can canoe kayak on. And then this big promenade is one of the big moves from the sea to the mountains. So the mountains are up there. It brings you all the way to the sea. I'll tell you about this little bridge in a bit. And my role on the project, it was mostly landscape architects on the project, and they wanted me on it just to like work on anything sort of architectural and to work with a local architect on like the restroom buildings and all of that kind of stuff. One of my favorite things about the park was that 80% of the project material is a huge, huge park, comes from within 100 kilometers. So, and that's kind of weird for Greece. You usually think that designing around here, that's going to be like everything's made of wood, right? That's the most sustainable thing. In Greece, they don't have wood, so it's not a sustainable material for them to use. We used a lot of aluminum, which they produce there. And then we used a lot of concrete that we harvest on site from the runways. So here's a diagram of that. There's actually this big concrete sorter on site, so they throw all the concrete in, except for some beautiful slabs that they're saving for us for design elements. And it separates it into different sizes, and the smallest stuff gets used for road base, and then it like spits out all these. It's really beautiful. I had a video of it and I wanted it to put it here, I couldn't find it. And then bigger pieces get used for aggregate. And you can see here that the concrete is like gorgeous. That was just runway, but it was built in like the 60s, so they did things differently then. And so that was the first trial of some of the furniture that we're designing with it. And here you can see it in one of the early renderings. In the background, it's being used as part of a water feature. It's being used as aggregate in the pavers. And then here's a view of the Saarinen building in the background with a big event lawn, and you can see the transformation. It's all used to be runways. Well, we're reusing a lot of elements like these light poles. Okay, so now to my aspect of what I worked on this project. So coming from that material inspiration, they asked us to make a custom line of furniture for the park. They want you to like walk into the park boundary and know I'm in Olinikon Park. So we use the idea again of C2 mountains and aluminum to concrete to create this line of furniture that reuses that concrete from the runways and this thin tubular aluminum, as well as hints of wood just for that warmth. And then also worked on a bunch of sort of follies all throughout the site that pick up on some of those same forms and create spaces for people to gather and have events. And then a big portion of my work on the project was actually a bridge. And kind of returning back to my thesis, it's a garden bridge that crosses over the big highway that cuts off the inland part of the site from the coast. And we wanted to make sure you felt like you were still in the park while you were on the bridge. And one of the cool things I think about this bridge is we couldn't have trees the whole way around, it was too heavy. So only when there's a column do we have a little grove of trees. And then I think it just makes a nice little relationship between your experience on the bridge and the structure of the bridge. So then you come to the end of the bridge onto the coastal front, and there's this big cascade of steps coming down, and I worked on all of that. And I'll end on this slide. This is under construction. The last time I visited, they came across an ancient city, which is pretty typical when you're working in Greece. So we need to redesign that area a little bit. And then on the right, those are graves that they found. Also very typical. And if you found graves on a site here, your project would be delayed by like 10 years. But what they do there, they take the grave out, they look at it for academic purposes, and then they buried it again. So yeah, coming full circle back to bridges and cemeteries. Thanks.
Ruthie Kuhlman, please.
Great, thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Ruthie. Excited to kind of piggyback on what Lucca's been sharing. You know, I think we both look at design in a similar way, and I think, you know, the landscape aspect of it, this will transition more into how I've been looking at it in buildings that I've been working on, but really focusing on, you know, this idea of sculpting spaces to really shape your experience as you move through them, and how you can do that to create something that feels really like a place that you remember and can connect to. And so my thesis, and I appreciate that you gave an overview on the kind of overall process of it. This was 10 years ago, and I think probably is even more of a thing today, but I was looking at, right, the transformation of from analog to digital, and focusing on the Boston Globe in particular, which has since moved from their headquarters, but they were still printing and using the printing press then. And so I wanted to explore this idea of what does it mean to physically interact with, you know, your news? What does it mean to physically interact with your city as opposed to being kind of on a screen all of the time? So what I tried to study was this idea of, you know, how we move through space and how we interact with the buildings that we see and how that shapes our perspective on experience of it. And I wanted to study a new headquarter for the Globe that would really embody that experience. I think you also get, as you read the news and look at different things, you're shaping your understanding of the world. So my process started out exploring through collage, how, you know, taking different pieces of buildings and putting it on a site really changed your perspective on the site and the city around it based on what you could see and where it might lead you. And so for the site, I picked the Greenway in Boston, one of the parcels, and I selected, you can see on the left here, it's parcel 19. And I was really intrigued by this because it's one of those great Boston conditions where you have tons of roads that intersect at all of these different angles and connect into it. So it's great to test this idea of vantage points coming from multiple directions. And so the building form, which you can see across the top of the screen here, started to respond to both that kind of continuity that you have on the Greenway, but also orient itself so that building faces started to be perpendicular to all of these different approaches. And then on the bottom, you can see there some studies at a facade system that would basically be a series of fins that would allow this kind of view framing for everything that's perpendicular to you and cut out the view from everything that's on the oblique. So essentially, to understand the building, my goal was you would have to actually walk around the entire building, and being at different points in the city would connect you to different points within the Boston Globe, so that you kind of were having this curated moment of connection, which I tied into how the news curates our perspective on the overall city and experience. And so these are some renderings that I did to kind of test this out even further. Standing on the greenway, looking at the building. I wanted it to be something that had the greenway continue through it and also speak to kind of the unified face of the Boston Globe, while also having that feeling that you really needed to walk around it from different sides to see and experience it all. And you can see here a few other views of just key moments inside the building, connecting in specific ways to the outside. The center image was looking at the newsroom and really thinking about this kind of where the news is formed, becoming this kind of stage that the city is all surrounding and connecting to. So with that, I'll transition into my professional work. And I will say, I think one of the great opportunities being at the BAC is you get to explore your own process at school, but you also can work in different firms and really understand the design process there. And I think finding a firm that fits with the design process and how you like to do things really just makes it fun to kind of transition from the academic world into the professional. And so I'm at Ruthie Architects, and this is just a little image of kind of how we've been looking at design as we think about it. We've kind of come up with these 3 pillars, which are across everything that we do in design, but really focusing on them, focusing on the site and the context, focusing on the concept for the project, and then also focusing really on the program and the massing. I think all 3 are kind of individual elements, and when they're all really working, they come together to create a super dynamic project. And I'll say too, a lot of what we do at school focuses on the idea, right? It's like concept and site and how they tie together. But as you get more into the professional realm, the program and massing and the finances of it and all of this become huge. And so trying to not lose sight of site and concept, I think, is really, really important for strong architecture and trying to balance all of it. So I'm going to walk you through a couple of multifamily residential projects here in the city. One's here in the city of Boston, one's in Worcester. These are projects that very much focus on budget, in addition to us trying to push things that will become places in the city. So this first one, you can see the site here in the center in white is in East Boston. It's right by the airport. It's actually right by the airport T-stop. You can see it highlighted right here. It's a very tricky site because it's 80 feet deep and over 400 feet long. It also is this kind of key location, which you can see based on the site right next to the airport blue line, so very transit oriented, but it abuts 2 districts. You can see one district of a much smaller grain of triple deckers, and then the kind of expansive, beautiful East Boston Greenway that's adjacent to it. And so when we started looking at this project, what we really started thinking was these 3 things and how they start to interact and what does this mean for this project. And I think as we talk about this, and we focus so much on site analysis and our concept, but I think it's really the merger of those that starts to get interesting. So here, rather than each one having one, the kind of site and concept was about using the fabric of the neighborhood to create something that's responsive to it. The site and program was, this needed to be a really efficient multifamily building. It had to be one building on a 400-foot long site because the economics didn't work for 2. So these are just kind of these requirements, right, that are getting layered in that define the success of the project. And then I think where the massing started to tie into the concept, and I'll show you some diagrams of these, was, really creating this sculptural form on the site based on its location that could become this backdrop to the park, and really using materiality to break down the length of this long building. So these are just some diagrams that we explored to kind of figure out how this would come together. This looks at, you can see the site kind of in red here and all of the triple deckers that surround it, but taking the module of that triple decker and kind of laying it out across the site and using that to actually create the module of the homes we were creating so that they're also expressing themselves in that same kind of way. And then we also looked at the building as having two faces. It kind of has a neighborhood face and kind of public park face. And so the neighborhood face, we wanted to feel more like a backyard aspect that's reacting to the language in the neighborhood. And then the park wanted to become something a little more sculptural facing Bremen Street. And so this is a little axon here, kind of showing how that started to come together. We really looked at, to create the sculpture, we needed something that was simple, that was extruded up to make this economical to build. But we looked at the idea of roof forms, and we have the public library by William Rahn at the end of the East Boston Greenway. If you look at the housing in East Boston, right, the typical house kind of has that gable, and there's a lot of flat in there as well. So looking at how do we use that to define something that speaks of home, but also starts to create the sculptural edge that we thought the library had started. And so that's what we were looking at here. And you can see two material colors, looking at changing the material, a brick where the red is, that would designate the entries that would land on the ground, and then a natural wood that would kind of become this sculpting, undulating element that would be floating a little bit above the sidewalk. And so real quick, just so you can see, this is some facts about the project, but this is that very efficient floor plan that the interior of the building is laid out, in a rectilinear way, but we're able to kind of shape the front facade so that it has angles and sculpting that land in each of these units, but it's still able to be built in a kind of efficient and straightforward manner. And so these are some renderings of the project. You can see the one on the top is standing at the airport T stop looking out. You can see the kind of change in materiality and the change in form. We really wanted to use natural materials, and I think that's something that we're looking at in all of our work, is how can we bring more natural materials into buildings, especially things that are adjacent to parks, which I think are some of the funnest buildings to design when they interact with the natural world. But this is a dark brick that's used on these anchoring elements where the entries are. And then we're using modified wood that's sustainable, but also does not rot and will change over time from a dark brown to a light gray. So it's kind of a living building that will shift as it ages. And then a few other pieces, you can see on the bottom images, some of the corners of the building. We did step down from 5 stories to 4 stories to start to kind of knit into the surrounding fabric of the neighborhood. And then this is an image here of the corner, the main corner where you, on Brooks and Bremen Street, if you're familiar with East Boston, where you walk when you come off of the T-stop. And really looking, the community feedback was really about transforming the sidewalk experience here. So this is a widened sidewalk. You can see some of the building forms, the wood kind of projecting out over it. So there's moments where you can walk underneath the building. And then the other piece to layer in is one of the challenges of this site. One of the challenges in a lot of Boston sites is the floodplain and global warming and sea level rise. And so it was an issue here. So you can see that, on the corner, the retail area is raised up. All of the entries are raised up. We have sloped walkways that kind of intersect with the sidewalks and connect you up into the building. And we really wanted to try to balance this approach to make it still feel welcoming and open on the streetscape, even though that is lower than the floodplain, but get the right amount raised. And then I'll share one view with you. So the top is a rendering and the bottom is an image from actually this morning. It's a snowy day in East Boston, but you can see building's currently under construction. It has been for the past kind of year and a half, finishing up in May of this year. So exciting to kind of see this come through. And if you guys are in East Boston and as you travel through, you can see the wood on there and see how it ages over time, which I think we're all pretty excited to see this kind of living building. All right. So my second project to share with you all, now jumping to Worcester, Massachusetts. And if you're not familiar with Worcester, it's in kind of the central Massachusetts area. It's a city that has this great industrial past and has had kind of, I'd say, a resurgence in the past number of years, where there's a lot more kind of life and housing and elements going in. And so this project is located in the Canal District of Worcester, which interestingly enough, used to have a canal running through it, which is why it was named that, but it got buried. But that's where Polar Park moved to. And, there's lots of housing and development kind of going on in that area. And so this is a little diagram. You can see the site circled in orange. The little site is in red here. And this is kind of living within the Canal District. And one of the interesting things about this district has these great kind of historic buildings, industrial buildings in it, but it's also flanked by an elevated railroad, which you can see in blue, and Interstate 290, which is right next to our site, which you can see in yellow. So it's kind of this district that's cut off from the surrounding areas by heavy transportation, but has all these great connections through it. And so in the same way, we looked at how, we were going to tackle this, how these different elements would come together. And so, looking at program and site, we knew we needed a high density residential project here that would be responsive to zoning and context. And it's funny to say, the city of Worcester is way ahead of the city of Boston in terms of updating their zoning. So this was zoned adjacent to the highway for 100 feet. So we could do a 9-story building as of right here. The kind of site and concept came together, and how we really wanted to respond to the edge condition, particularly the 290 edge condition, which is right across the street, and also really respond to the architecture that surrounded it. And then the reason why I picked this one to bring today was our client really influenced the kind of concept and massing and how it came together by having a goal of doing a really sustainable project. So this is designed as a mass timber project and a passive house project, which really drove a lot of our thinking and design throughout it. And our kind of concept, which I'll share with you, came out of the idea of mass timber and this idea that you can really expose the warmth of the material on the interior of the building. So some diagrams, because we like to diagram things a lot at Rhody, but just to think through our process. So you can see here kind of massing buildup on the bottom and the plan on the top. But starting on the left, the major site condition at this site, which is shown in red, is Interstate 290, which is highlighted in orange, and it's an elevated highway, so there's a space underneath it. And so when we looked at it, we saw this opportunity that Grafton Street, which is a street right next to it, was going to be this busy vehicular-oriented street. But Temple Street, which connects over back into the district, has this possibility for becoming something that's a lot more pedestrian friendly. And so our kind of site design concept came off of that, with this idea of moving quickly down Grafton and then coming around the corner to Temple and slowing down. And so we used some of those forces to kind of do some slight shifts and angles of the building. So again, keeping something that's simple and rectilinear on the inside, but sculpting the outside a little bit to start to create this pocket park that would show up on Temple Street, and also to offset the faces of the building so that they're not staring directly at the highway, but looking slightly adjacent to it. And the other piece, which you can see on the bottom right, is we adjusted the heights. So the building steps down and has an exterior deck on Temple Street, where it's a little more pedestrian scale, and kind of steps up with a mechanical penthouse as you get around to Grafton Street at the highway. So then this is where we started to think about the character of the building, and we really wanted to bring in our inspiration from the structure. And so this diagram at the top is kind of something that we created to tell that story. And so, the thing about mass timber is it starts as this beautiful, fresh wood, right? And the building structure, and I have a slide on this, but comes out of all of it. And why it works and is so strong is because you can, if it catches fire, which hopefully it will not, but if it does, it creates a char layer on the outside and then stops burning. So the structure is actually intact throughout it. So we thought of this process that the material goes through as this kind of transformation that gets this char layer, and then you have this opportunity for carving away and revealing the fresh wood that's underneath, and that has the opportunity for creating something new and fresh. It kind of relates to the transformation that we were seeing of the city of Worcester and how it's, you know, building on its past to create something new and fresh. And so some images of Worcester on the bottom. One other thing I'll point out is some of the language of the industrial buildings there. You can see the bottom center image directly adjacent to our site. It's the Bradley Osgood building. So we used all of these, right? The massing, this concept, the language of Worcester to come together and create a building design that really utilizes this kind of charcoal material on the exterior, accentuating, you know, some of these subtle moves that create a pocket park on the ground level, the intersecting of volumes. But where we started to think about how this has an impact on the users is anywhere on the inside where if you're carving away for a balcony or you're carving away for the entry, you're revealing this wood. And that when you get into your units, you have this experience of wood within it. And so I'll pivot slightly to a quick overview of mass timber for anyone who's not familiar with it. Hopefully everyone's getting familiar with it in school because it's very exciting to be able to build a structural system that you can actually expose. And so in Massachusetts, we have a new building code coming out any day now, who knows when, but when it comes out, it will be bringing these new mass timber heights into the current code. And so there's 3 types, and I won't get into it, but basically you can build up to 18 stories of mass timber now in the state, and you can expose varying amounts of that structure so that it gives character to the units. And so this is a structural model of our building in Worcester. The whole system is built with, you know, it has wood columns, it has wood beams, and then it has wood plank floors that go across them. So basically the entire system is wood. You do put some gypcrete for sound insulation on the floor, so the floors aren't exposed, but you can expose most of the rest of the structure. And so this are some interior images, and I think this is probably the part of the project I'm the most excited about, is this idea that we can create these spaces that you can come into the building, but you can actually move through and experience the structure and experience the warmth of it in a way that I think we haven't been seeing in a lot of housing, that really makes it feel like home and feel like something that you're actually experiencing the space in. So upper left is a little rendering of one of our corner 2-bedroom units, which you can see in the floor plans here. They have balconies on the exterior facade. The 2 images on the right are of our amenity space, which is directly adjacent to that roof deck. And then you can kind of see from the floor plan here, just some of the exposed ceiling design that we going through. And so this project is still in design right now. Progressing through, hopefully we'll be starting construction in the not too distant future. Yeah, but that is what I brought for today.
So I was hoping you guys would now both stand here and field questions in the room, and then I will see if there are any questions in the chat. So I need somebody to walk up to the microphone.
This is how it's done.
Thanks.
When I get done, you all can make your way up, so start with these other questions. I have a head start because I know both of these 2 are students. And it's so much fun because I got to see both of you really create as students. And then what a treat to come here and see you as architects, you know. And so thinking about many of these people being in thesis, I'm wondering, in hindsight, given what you've been through, if you had to give a piece of advice to all these people beginning a thesis, is there something you want to tell them? And you kind of didn't hear, but I mean, more like, hold
I've been talking a lot. You want to go first? I think this is what I always tell anyone who asks me that question, is just to have fun, because there's, and at work too, like if you're not having fun. I mean, sometimes you're gonna have to design a mechanical room, but yeah, just, you know, with your thesis, you can pick the theme, you can pick everything, so just like do whatever's the most fun.
That's good advice. And I'd add on and say, you know, I think we always focus so much on these beautiful images for presentations and other things like that, but I think sketching more, sketching different views, you know, using ways to use your hand to like print something out from the computer and just sketch over it, even if it's really simple. I think that just brings a lot more depth than being kind of stuck in a screen.
3 more questions and ready to move on. I specifically asked for the time to make the promotion. Yeah.
All right.
I'm actually from the Worcester area. Because you're still in the conceptual phase, in the design phase, I'm kind of wondering this just because I actually read some stuff about this recently. Due to Polar Park being in Worcester, along Grafton Street, all the bars that have been there for many years have actually been shut down. A lot of them are losing their business because of Polar Park, thinking it would bring in a lot of attention. Has that affected your design whatsoever? And the area and the have you like noticed any site conditions or anything like that?
So it's an interesting question because we did have a big community process that we went through with this. And so this site is, for reference, the old Fairway Beef site, which closed down, you know, a few years back. And so we did have a lot of meetings with the local business owners. I think from their perspective, they were excited about the residential development in terms of bringing folks that would be regulars and locals who would kind of connect in with that. There obviously, we heard a lot of concern, and just so everyone knows, when Polar Park came in, right, one of the big things as you start to go into community processes is this conversation about, a lot of it's around parking and traffic and the changing of the neighborhood. And so there's been a lot of challenges with parking, especially right out in Worcester with Polar Park. And so I think one of the things that we do as designers going out into communities, hearing all of the concerns and, you know, trying to do something in the design that will mitigate them as much as we can. A lot of them are out of our control, but what we wanted to do was create a place that would make Temple Street and the connection to Grafton more pedestrian friendly and start to transform, be the leading transformer of that edge to kind of hopefully keep all the local businesses and the foot traffic and all of that going.
Thank you. It was just ironic that kind of all this ties in. So thank you.
I have a question in the chat. And then we're up to, Jackie Kennard wants to know more about how Worcester's building code, zoning code is more progressive than Boston.
That's a great question. So I think the interesting thing about zoning codes and how we shape the city is that all cities do this. They involve, right, the participation of the people who live in the city. So there's lots of community outreach and lots of discussions. And so the city of Boston has lots of zoning studies going on, but they're such a big city that it's a Herculean effort to get, you know, these studies for different regions, and they do it and they push it through. But it means that a lot of the time the zoning, you know, where we're putting in larger scale buildings is zoned for 2 or 3 family homes, and it's just not the kind of way the city is moving. I think Worcester, and this is my opinion of it from the experience I've had there, but being a slightly smaller city, was able to kind of think through where density made sense, where less scale made sense, and create an overall plan that is easier to kind of follow. Because a lot of the challenges that we run into is that economic aspect of the projects where you have to build something of a certain scale right now to kind of have it work. And of course, that needs to work with the actual urban planning of the city fit into the fabric and how it's gonna grow and how much open space you have and all of that. And I think Boston is actively working on it. The newer administration, I think, has put special focus on it. So it'll be exciting to see what happens next. But right now, most things in the city of Boston require a variance, whereas in other cities, if you've planned it out, ideally, you're following the plan that they've laid out and you don't need one.
I'm from a firm in Ocean County, New Jersey. We're actually doing a project in Massachusetts. You mentioned that there's a new code waiting to drop anytime soon. So I'm wondering, a project that's still in the design phase, will it need to adjust to the new code? If you know the answer.
Yeah, no, so that's a great question too, as you're doing kind of real work out in the city and in the state. So there's usually an overlap period of 6 months once a new code gets released. That is a concurrence period. So things that started in design don't have to, and are far along, don't have to change. So that would start whenever the project would, or whenever the code would be released. But it all depends on the particular code and what's in it.
Can I add something to that?
Yes, please do.
Do you want to see more about codes?
Yeah.
Just to let you know that if you're members of the BSA, they have a lot of online and in-person overviews of the code changes. There's been a lot recently, especially around sustainability, and they're really useful.
So I wanted to follow up, Lucca, with a question about the kind of drawings you shared for tonight's project. You're drawing by hand, and you're obviously also drawing in software. And I'm curious where the transition happens, and is that specific to Sasaki or your process at Sasaki? Could you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. So my process is it's influenced by the landscape side of Sasaki. So we have a couple different disciplines: landscape, architecture, interiors, graphics, civil. And I find the landscape discipline to be a little freer with sketching, and the architecture discipline to be worried about, making an ugly drawing or whatever. And so thankfully I got to see a lot of ugly drawings from like principals and stuff that made me feel a lot more comfortable sketching. And so my process when I'm working on like just coming up with ideas is I'll just sketch and make something ugly first, and then model something or have someone else model something based on that sketch, and then sketch over it again. And then model it again and sketch over it again and print it out and sketch over it, or sketch on my iPad also. And yeah, sometimes I'll just get lost in a sketch and it'll turn out nice enough to show a client.
You guys, first of all, thanks, this was great. Both of you guys have a thread that clearly carried you from thesis through your work today. So we've got like the landscape aspect of things, and then your sculptural shaping and massing. How much of that is you guys intentionally making sure you hold on to that thing that is your thing? And how much do you feel like that happens as you kind of progress through your professional career?
That's a great question. I think is a question to continue asking throughout a professional career.
Yeah.
And I would say on mine, I found a place to work that had a similar approach to me. And I worked a few other places beforehand, which were amazing firms, but I think it just wasn't the same kind of thinking and approach. And when I saw the work that Rhodey was doing, I saw a lot of synergies, which how I like to look at things, and that was able to kind of fuse together to let me keep exploring in that way, which I think was really exciting and is still exciting.
For me, it was very intentional. I asked to be on that first project I asked to be on a lot of projects. I asked not to be on some projects. I get in trouble sometimes. But I think it's worked out.
Yeah, I guess the takeaway would be intentional on both of our parts to make sure that we were kind of on the paths that we wanted to be on. And taking control of what you want to do and kind of where you want to go and trying to find those right opportunities. And really I think using your time as students to explore and to try new things, because it's a lot easier to kind of shift and try something new as a student.
Yeah, and once you have like one project under your belt, that's something that you care about, then you're like the person that does those things. Because, I mean, a project takes like 5 years, so. Yeah, and then even if that project is your thesis, like I was put on a project for a chapel early on at Sasaki because I had designed a chapel before, theoretically, and no one else had. So, yeah, even your thesis kind of you can use that professionally too.